The sound of a circuit breaker tripping at 3 a.m. is never a good sign. When it happens 3 nights in a row at a multi-million-dollar ranch in the middle of nowhere, it starts to feel personal. By the time I figured out why Hailey's electrical system was failing, I realized we weren't dealing with faulty wiring or power surges. We were dealing with theft on a scale that would make professional criminals jealous. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I've been Hailey Bieber's ranch manager and personal assistant for 2 years. I handle everything from coordinating her business meetings to managing the day-to-day operations of her 200-acre property outside Austin, Texas. When you're responsible for maintaining a working ranch that doubles as a celebrity retreat, you learn to expect the unexpected. But even my experience couldn't have prepared me for Karen Whitmore. Let me paint you the picture. Hailey's ranch sits on a beautiful piece of Texas hill country, complete with rolling pastures, a main house that could grace the cover of Architectural Digest, and enough solar panels to power a small town. The property borders a high-end residential development called Silver Creek Estates, where the HOA fees cost more than most people's mortgages and the community standards make military regulations look casual. It's Tuesday morning in September, and I'm walking the property line doing my weekly inspection when I notice something that makes my blood run cold. Someone has installed what appears to be professional-grade electrical conduit running from Hailey's main power distribution panel across the property line and into the Silver Creek development. This isn't some amateur operation with extension cords and duct tape. This is sophisticated electrical work that would require permits, professional equipment, and someone with serious knowledge of power systems. But according to my records, nobody has requested access to our electrical system, and no work has been authorized on the property line. I follow the conduit trail across the fence and into Silver Creek Estates, where it leads directly to the back of a pristine white house with perfectly manicured landscaping and a BMW parked in the circular driveway. The electrical line connects to what appears to be a secondary distribution panel that's been cleverly hidden behind decorative shrubs. That's when I see her. Karen Whitmore, 35 years old, emerges from the house wearing her signature white tennis outfit, clipboard in hand, surveying her domain with the satisfaction of someone who believes the world exists for her convenience. She's the same Karen who made headlines a few months ago for pepper spraying Justin Bieber's service dog, but apparently federal prison time hasn't dampened her enthusiasm for taking whatever she wants. I approach the property line with my phone ready to document what I'm seeing. "Excuse me," I call out, keeping my voice professional but firm. "I'm Maya Rodriguez. I manage the adjacent property. Could you explain why there's electrical conduit running from our power system to your house?" Karen turns to face me with the kind of smile that immediately makes you check your wallet. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about. Are you perhaps confused about property boundaries?" She's lying, and we both know it. The electrical conduit is visible from where we're standing, running in a straight line from Hailey's distribution panel to her backyard. But Karen has perfected the art of gaslighting with the precision of someone who's made it a career. "Ma'am, there's a direct electrical connection between your house and the ranch property. This appears to be unauthorized utility access, which is theft." Karen's smile becomes even more predatory. "Young lady, I think you're mistaken. Silver Creek Estates has its own electrical infrastructure managed by our community association. We don't need to steal power from anyone, especially from Hollywood types who probably don't even pay their own bills." The casual dismissal and subtle dig at Hailey tells me everything I need to know about Karen's motivations. This isn't just about stealing electricity. It's about entitlement, class resentment, and someone who believes she deserves whatever she wants simply because she wants it. "Ma'am, I'm looking at the physical connection right now. Would you like me to trace the conduit from your distribution panel back to our property line?" That's when Karen's mask slips completely. "Listen carefully, Miss Rodriguez. I am the president of the Silver Creek Estates HOA, and I don't appreciate being accused of theft by domestic staff. If your employer has concerns about community infrastructure, she can address them through proper channels." Domestic staff. The phrase hangs in the air between us like a slap. Karen has managed to insult my profession, dismiss my authority, and avoid addressing the evidence of electrical theft all in one perfectly crafted sentence. "Ma'am, this isn't an HOA matter. This is potential criminal activity involving utility theft. I'm documenting the electrical connection and contacting the appropriate authorities." I start taking photos of the conduit, the connection points, and the path from her house to our property line. Karen's reaction is immediate and telling. "You're trespassing on community property," she declares, stepping closer with aggressive body language. "I'm ordering you to stop photographing and leave immediately." I'm standing on a public easement documenting potential criminal activity. That's not trespassing, and you don't have authority to order me anywhere." Karen pulls out her phone with the dramatic flair of someone who believes that speed dial to authorities is the ultimate power move. "I'm calling community security to report trespassing and harassment by ranch staff." "Go ahead," I reply, continuing to document the electrical connections. "I'll be calling the sheriff's department to report utility theft and property damage." The threat of law enforcement involvement seems to rattle Karen in a way that my photographic evidence didn't. For the first time in our conversation, her confident authority wavers slightly. "There's no theft occurring," she insists, but her voice lacks the conviction of someone who believes what they're saying. "Any electrical connections are legitimate community infrastructure improvements. Improvements that nobody authorized and nobody's paying for except the property owner whose electricity is being stolen." I've dealt with difficult people in my years managing high-profile properties, but Karen represents something different. She's not just entitled or demanding. She's someone who's convinced herself that her desires justify any behavior, including what appears to be systematic theft from a neighbor she's decided doesn't deserve community respect. As I finish documenting the evidence, Karen makes one final attempt to assert control. "Miss Rodriguez, I suggest you inform your employer that good neighbors work together to resolve community issues. Threats and accusations don't create the kind of relationships that benefit everyone involved." The thinly veiled threat is clear. Play along with Karen's version of events or face escalating harassment from someone who's already demonstrated a willingness to break federal law when it suits her purposes. "Ma'am, good neighbors don't steal electricity. They certainly don't install unauthorized electrical connections to other people's property, and they definitely don't try to gaslight people who discover their theft." I turn and walk back toward Hailey's property, Karen's voice following me with increasing volume and decreasing composure. "This conversation isn't over, Miss Rodriguez. The Silver Creek Estates HOA doesn't tolerate harassment from outsiders." As I cross back onto ranch property, I realize that Karen Whitmore has made a fundamental miscalculation. She's picked a fight with someone who has the resources, documentation, and legal backing to expose her theft. More importantly, she's stolen from someone whose platform could turn this local crime into a national conversation about entitlement, theft, and accountability. I pull out my phone and dial the Travis County Sheriff's Department. When someone answers, I identify myself and explain that I need to report utility theft and property damage involving potentially thousands of dollars in stolen electricity. "Ma'am, we'll need to send a deputy to document the theft and assess the electrical modifications. Can you meet an officer at the property in an hour?" "I'll be here," I confirm, looking back toward Karen's house, where I can see her pacing behind her perfectly trimmed hedges. And I suspect the suspect will be available for questioning as well. What Karen doesn't know yet is that utility theft in Texas is a felony carrying up to 10 years in prison. What she also doesn't know is that Hailey's ranch electrical system includes smart monitoring that's been recording every kilowatt of stolen power for months. The evidence is overwhelming, the crime is documented, and the perpetrator has just spent 20 minutes lying to someone with a camera and a direct line to law enforcement. Sometimes justice comes through complex legal proceedings, sometimes it comes through social media exposure, and sometimes it comes through a sheriff's deputy with handcuffs and a very clear understanding of Texas property law. Karen Whitmore is about to discover which kind of justice applies to people who steal electricity from their famous neighbors while wearing tennis whites and carrying a clipboard. Deputy James Morrison arrived exactly 53 minutes later, driving a Travis County Sheriff's Patrol unit that looked like it meant business. I watched from the ranch's main driveway as he parked at the property line and stepped out wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd dealt with utility theft cases before and wasn't impressed by people who thought they could steal their way to lower electric bills. Morrison was maybe 45, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades dealing with rural crime and suburban entitlement in equal measure. He carried a clipboard, a digital camera, and what appeared to be some kind of electrical testing equipment. This wasn't his first rodeo. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Deputy Morrison. You called about utility theft." "Yes, sir. I can show you the electrical connections running from our property to the house across the fence line." As we walked toward the evidence, I noticed Karen's house had gone suspiciously quiet. The BMW was still in the driveway, but I hadn't seen any movement behind the windows since Morrison arrived. Apparently, Karen's enthusiasm for confrontation dimmed considerably when actual law enforcement showed up. "How long has this been going on?" Morrison asked, examining the conduit installation with the practiced eye of someone who understood electrical systems. "We're not sure exactly, but our smart monitoring system shows unusual power consumption patterns going back at least 4 months. The circuit breaker trip started 3 days ago, which is what led me to investigate. Morrison nodded, taking photos of the connection points and the path of the stolen electrical line. Ma'am, this is professional-grade work. Someone spent serious money on this installation. This isn't some weekend DIY project. That was exactly what I'd been thinking. The theft wasn't opportunistic or impulsive. Someone had planned this carefully, invested in quality materials, and executed it with enough skill to avoid detection for months. That level of premeditation turned simple theft into something much more serious. Have you spoken with the homeowner about this? Morrison asked. I tried. She denied everything and called me domestic staff who didn't understand community infrastructure. Morrison's expression shifted to something that suggested he'd encountered Karen's particular brand of entitled condescension before. Would that be Karen Whitmore? You know her? Ma'am, we've had several interactions with Ms. Whitmore over various community disputes. She tends to believe that HOA authority supersedes actual law enforcement. The way Morrison said it suggested that Karen's reputation with local law enforcement wasn't particularly positive. Apparently, her pattern of thinking rules didn't apply to her extended beyond disability discrimination into general criminal behavior. Let's go have a conversation with her, Morrison said, adjusting his duty belt with the kind of deliberate movement that meant business was about to be conducted. We walked across the property line and up to Karen's front door, where Morrison knocked with the authoritative rap of someone who expected answers. The silence stretched long enough to make it clear that Karen was hoping we'd just go away. Travis County Sheriff's Department, Morrison called out. We need to speak with the homeowner about a utility theft report. More silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door with obvious reluctance. Karen opened the door wearing the same white tennis outfit from earlier, but her confident demeanor had been replaced with the careful defensiveness of someone who knew they were in trouble. Her clipboard was nowhere to be seen. Officer, there seems to be some misunderstanding, she began, but Morrison cut her off with professional efficiency. Ma'am, I'm Deputy Morrison. We're investigating a report of utility theft involving electrical connections between your property and the adjacent ranch. I need to ask you some questions and examine the electrical installation. I don't know anything about utility theft, Karen replied, but her voice lacked the conviction she'd shown earlier. The Silver Creek Estates HOA manages all community infrastructure improvements. Morrison pulled out his notepad with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he'd heard that excuse before. Ma'am, can you show me documentation authorizing the electrical connection between your house and the ranch property? Karen's pause was long enough to power a small city. I would need to check with the HOA board about specific infrastructure documentation. Ma'am, utility theft is a felony in Texas. If you have authorization for this electrical connection, now would be the time to produce it. The word felony seemed to hit Karen like a physical blow. For someone who'd built her entire identity around controlling others through bureaucratic authority, the reality of facing serious criminal charges was clearly overwhelming. Perhaps there's been some confusion about community electrical systems, she tried weakly. Ma'am, there's no confusion. We have clear documentation of unauthorized electrical connections between your property and the ranch. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with this investigation, or whether we need to escalate this to criminal charges. That's when Karen made the mistake that would define the rest of her day. Instead of admitting the theft and cooperating with the investigation, she doubled down on her lies with the kind of desperate creativity that only comes from someone watching their world collapse in real time. Officer, I believe this is a case of mistaken identity. The ranch property has been having electrical problems, and their staff is trying to blame community infrastructure for their own maintenance issues. Morrison looked at her with the expression of someone who'd just been insulted by an amateur. Ma'am, I've examined the electrical connections. This is professional-grade conduit running directly from the ranch's distribution panel to your house. Are you claiming this happened accidentally? I'm saying that community electrical systems can be complex, and sometimes connections exist for legitimate infrastructure reasons that non-technical people don't understand. It was masterful gaslighting, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent years convincing people that their own observations were wrong. But Morrison wasn't a Platinum Heights resident who could be intimidated by clipboard authority and tennis outfit superiority. Ma'am, I'm going to need to examine your electrical panel and trace these connections. Do I have your permission to inspect the installation, or do I need to obtain a warrant? Karen's face cycled through several expressions as she realized that her options had narrowed to cooperation or escalation. Either way, the theft was going to be exposed and documented. I suppose you can look at the electrical panel, she said finally, but I want it understood that any community infrastructure was installed according to HOA protocols. Morrison and I followed Karen to her backyard, where the secondary electrical panel was hidden behind decorative shrubs with the kind of careful concealment that screamed criminal intent. Morrison removed the panel cover and immediately began documenting what he found. "Ma'am, this panel is receiving power directly from the ranch property through approximately 200 feet of buried conduit. The installation includes circuit breakers, distribution components, and consumption monitoring equipment. This is sophisticated electrical theft." Karen watched Morrison photograph her illegal electrical system with the expression of someone watching their entire defense strategy crumble in real time. The evidence was overwhelming. The installation was clearly intentional, and her attempts at gaslighting were falling apart under professional scrutiny. "How much power has been stolen?" I asked. Morrison checked his testing equipment and consulted some kind of monitoring device he'd connected to the panel. "Based on the circuit configuration and these readings, I'd estimate somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 kilowatt-hours over the past several months." I did the math quickly. At Texas residential rates, Karen had stolen between $1,000 and $1,800 worth of electricity. In Texas, utility theft over $1,500 is a state jail felony carrying up to 2 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. "Ma'am," Morrison said to Karen, "you're under arrest for utility theft, a state jail felony. You have the right to remain silent." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was remarkably satisfying after months of mysterious electrical problems and Karen's aggressive denial of obvious evidence. She was wearing the same white tennis outfit that had become her signature, but now it looked less like suburban armor and more like a costume for someone playing a role they were no longer qualified for. "This is harassment," Karen declared as Morrison led her toward his patrol car. "The HOA will be filing complaints about this treatment." "Ma'am, utility theft is a criminal matter, not an HOA matter. Your community association doesn't have authority over state felony charges." As Morrison placed Karen in the back of his patrol car, neighbors began emerging from their houses with the curiosity of people who'd been wondering what all the law enforcement activity was about. The sight of their HOA president being arrested for stealing electricity was clearly not what they'd expected to witness on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Morrison approached me as Karen sat in the patrol car, her white tennis outfit visible through the rear window like a flag of surrender. "Miss Rodriguez, we'll need a formal statement and documentation of the electrical monitoring data from your system." "Of course. How much trouble is she in?" "State jail felony for utility theft over $1,500. Potential additional charges for criminal mischief and property damage. If she's convicted, she's looking at up to 2 years in prison and significant fines." I watched Karen through the patrol car window as Morrison radioed for additional units to secure the crime scene. Her confident authority had completely evaporated, replaced by the stunned expression of someone who'd never considered that their actions might have real consequences. "Deputy Morrison, what happens to the electrical connection?" "We'll have the power company disconnected immediately as evidence of criminal activity. Ms. Whitmore's house will need to rely on legitimate electrical service going forward." As if on cue, a Texas electric service truck pulled up to begin disconnecting Karen's illegal power source. Within minutes, her house would be running on whatever electricity she was actually paying for, which based on the sophisticated theft operation wasn't going to be nearly enough. The irony was perfect. Karen had installed an elaborate criminal enterprise to steal power from a neighbor she considered unworthy of community respect. Now she was facing felony charges while her victim stood in the sunshine documenting justice being served with Texas efficiency. Sometimes crime pays until it doesn't. Sometimes entitlement works until it meets someone who understands the law better than you do. And sometimes the best way to steal electricity is to just pay for it like everyone else. Karen Whitmore was about to discover that utility theft isn't a community infrastructure improvement. It's a felony that comes with handcuffs and a very uncomfortable ride to the county jail. News travels fast in a gated community, especially when it involves the HOA president being arrested for felony theft in broad daylight. By the time Deputy Morrison's patrol car disappeared down the main road with Karen in the back seat, half of Silver Creek Estates was gathered along the property line like spectators at the world's most expensive crime scene. I was still standing in Karen's backyard watching Texas Electric Service disconnect her illegal power line, when the first neighbor approached me with the tentative steps of someone who'd been wanting to ask questions for months but had been too intimidated to speak up. "Excuse me," said a well-dressed woman in her 60s. "I'm Patricia Chen. I live 3 houses down. Is it true that Karen was stealing electricity?" "Yes, ma'am." She had professional electrical equipment installed to steal power from the ranch property. The sheriff's department arrested her about 20 minutes ago. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened like someone who just had a long-held suspicion confirmed. I knew something was wrong with her electric bills. She's been bragging at HOA meetings about how her monthly cost dropped by 60% after some efficiency improvements. Other residents were gathering now, drawn by the combination of law enforcement activity and the sight of their HOA president's house being disconnected from stolen power. I recognized several faces from community events, but their expressions were very different from the intimidated silence Karen usually commanded. She told us she'd installed some kind of advanced energy management system, said a man in his 40s wearing a golf shirt. Said it was too technical for most people to understand, but it could save everyone money if we followed her recommendations. The pieces were falling into place. Karen hadn't just stolen electricity for her own benefit. She'd been using her theft to establish credibility as some kind of energy efficiency expert, probably planning to expand her criminal operation throughout the community under the guise of HOA improvements. "How long has this been going on?" asked another resident. "Based on our monitoring data, at least 4 months, possibly longer." A woman with a small dog spoke up from the edge of the crowd. That's about when she started talking about community-wide electrical upgrades. She said she'd found a way to reduce everyone's power bills through better infrastructure management. I was starting to understand the full scope of Karen's plan. She hadn't just committed utility theft. She'd been using her stolen electricity to build a reputation as an energy expert, positioning herself to expand the criminal operation throughout Silver Creek Estates, while disguising it as legitimate HOA improvements. "Did she ask anyone else about accessing their electrical systems?" I asked. Several hands went up. Mrs. Chen spoke first. "She inspected my electrical panel 2 weeks ago, said she was evaluating infrastructure improvements for the whole community. She wanted to install some kind of monitoring equipment at my house," added the man in the golf shirt. "Said it would help optimize power consumption patterns." The criminal enterprise was bigger than I'd realized. Karen wasn't just stealing from Hailey. She was planning systematic utility theft throughout the entire community, using her HOA authority to gain access to residents' electrical systems while disguising her crimes as community improvements. My phone buzzed with a call from Hailey, who was in New York for a Fashion Week event. "Maya, I'm seeing news alerts about the ranch. What's going on?" I walked away from the crowd to take the call privately. "Hailey, we caught our neighbor stealing electricity. A lot of electricity. She's been arrested for felony theft." "The HOA president? The one who pepper-sprayed Scout?" "The very same. Apparently federal prison time didn't cure her of taking whatever she wants from other people." Hailey was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "How much did she steal?" "Probably between $1,200 and $1,800 worth of power over 4 months. But Maya, that's not the worst part. She was planning to expand the operation throughout her entire community." "Jesus. Are we pressing charges?" "Already in motion. She's been arrested for state jail felony utility theft." "But Hailey, this is going to get media attention. Karen's already famous for the service dog attack, and now she's been arrested for stealing electricity from you." "Let it get attention," Hailey said firmly. "I'm tired of people thinking they can take advantage of us just because we have money. If she wants to steal from us, she can face the consequences publicly." After I hung up, I noticed the Texas Electric Service technician approaching with a clipboard and a professional expression that suggested he'd dealt with utility theft before. "Ma'am, I'm Mike Torres with Texas Electric. I've disconnected the illegal connection, but I need to document the installation for our fraud investigation unit. How often do you see theft operations like this?" Torres shook his head with obvious disgust. "This is one of the most sophisticated residential theft setups I've encountered. Someone spent serious money on quality equipment and professional installation. This wasn't desperation theft, this was planned criminal enterprise." He showed me photos he'd taken of the electrical equipment. The secondary distribution panel, the buried conduit, the consumption monitoring equipment. This represents at least $5,000 in materials and professional electrical work. The irony was staggering. Karen had spent more money setting up her theft operation than she'd saved by stealing electricity. But the criminal infrastructure would have allowed her to expand the theft throughout Silver Creek Estates, potentially stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in power while disguising it as community improvements. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll be working with law enforcement to document the extent of the theft and calculate damages. This will also trigger an investigation into whether similar illegal connections exist elsewhere in the community." As Torres packed up his equipment, Deputy Morrison returned with a second patrol car and what appeared to be a crime scene technician. The investigation was expanding, and Karen's house was about to become the center of a major utility fraud case. Ms. Rodriguez, Morrison called out. We need to document the theft operation more thoroughly. This appears to be part of a larger criminal scheme. I spent the next hour walking investigators through the evidence, from the original circuit breaker problems to the discovery of the illegal connections. Every detail was photographed, measured, and documented with the kind of thoroughness that suggested this case was going to trial. But the real development came when Morrison received a call that made him look up from his notepad with obvious interest. Ma'am, that was our fraud unit. They've been reviewing Karen Whitmore's background, and this isn't her first utility theft arrest. What do you mean? She was investigated for similar charges in California 2 years ago, but the case was dropped when she relocated to Texas. Apparently, she's been running this same scam for years, using HOA positions to gain access to community electrical systems. The pattern was becoming clear. Karen wasn't just an entitled HOA president who decided to steal some electricity. She was a career criminal who specialized in utility fraud, using her authority and professional appearance to gain access to electrical systems in upscale communities. How many communities has she targeted? Based on preliminary investigation, at least 3 in California, and now this one in Texas. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in theft over several years. As the sun began setting over Silver Creek Estates, Karen's house sat dark and powerless while investigators documented her criminal operation. The residents who'd gathered to witness her arrest were still talking in small groups, sharing stories of her suspicious behavior and aggressive management tactics. Mrs. Chen approached me one final time as I prepared to return to the ranch. Rodriguez, I want you to know that most of us never supported Karen's methods. We were just too intimidated to speak up. Why were you intimidated? She made it clear that anyone who questioned her authority would face constant harassment through HOA violations and community pressure. She turned the association into a weapon against residents who didn't comply with her demands. The picture that emerged was of systematic abuse of authority that went far beyond utility theft. Karen had been using her position to terrorize residents into compliance while simultaneously stealing from neighboring properties to fund her criminal operations. As I drove back to the ranch that evening, I realized that Karen Whitmore's arrest represented more than just justice for electricity theft. It was the end of a criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as community leadership while terrorizing residents and stealing from neighbors. The community that had lived in fear of clipboard violations and HOA harassment was finally free to speak up about months of abuse. Karen's house sat dark and empty, no longer powered by stolen electricity or protected by intimidated silence. Sometimes criminals get away with their schemes because people are too afraid to report them. Sometimes they get caught because they pick the wrong target and steal from someone with the resources to fight back. And sometimes justice comes in the form of a Texas sheriff's deputy who understands that utility theft is a felony regardless of what kind of tennis outfit you're wearing when you commit it. Karen Whitmore had built her criminal empire on intimidation and theft. Both had just collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving her sitting in a county jail cell while her house ran out of power and her community finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. The only thing left was to see how much prison time career utility fraud would earn someone who thought HOA authority made her untouchable. By Thursday morning, Karen Whitmore had achieved something most career criminals spend years trying to avoid. She'd become the main character in a multi-state federal investigation that was trending on social media. The story had exploded overnight, with news outlets picking up on the narrative of an HOA president who'd gone from pepper-spraying service dogs to stealing electricity from celebrities while planning community-wide fraud. I arrived at the ranch to find 3 news vans parked outside the main gate and my phone buzzing with interview requests from reporters who'd apparently decided that utility theft was suddenly fascinating when it involved Hailey Bieber and a repeat offender with a tennis outfit obsession. The morning's developments started with a call from Detective Lisa Park, who'd been assigned to lead the expanded investigation into Karen's criminal enterprise. Her voice carried the kind of professional excitement that comes from discovering that a small local crime is actually part of something much bigger. Mr. Rodriguez, we've been reviewing Karen Whitmore's background, and we need to meet with you about what we've uncovered. Can you be available this morning for an interview with federal investigators? Federal investigators? Ma'am, utility theft across state lines is federal jurisdiction. When we started digging into Miss Whitmore's history, we found evidence of similar operations in California, Nevada, and Arizona. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is taking over the case. The implications hit me immediately. Karen wasn't just a local criminal who'd made a bad decision about stealing electricity. She was part of what appeared to be a systematic fraud operation that had been targeting upscale communities across the Southwest for years. How big is this investigation? Based on preliminary findings, we're looking at potential theft in excess of $500,000 across 4 states. Ms. Whitmore appears to have been using HOA positions to gain access to electrical infrastructure in high-end communities, then systematically stealing power while positioning herself as an energy efficiency expert. An hour later, I was sitting in the ranch's main conference room with FBI agent Sarah Kim, the same agent who'd handled Karen's service dog case, and Detective Park, watching them lay out evidence of what could only be described as the most sophisticated utility fraud scheme in recent memory. Karen Whitmore has held HOA leadership positions in 7 different communities over the past 8 years, Agent Kim explained, spreading out documents that tracked her movement across multiple states. In each location, residents reported mysterious improvements in her energy costs, followed by community-wide proposals for electrical infrastructure upgrades. The pattern was identical everywhere. Karen would move into an upscale community, gain HOA leadership, begin stealing electricity from neighboring properties to establish credibility as an energy expert, then propose community-wide improvements that would have allowed her to expand the theft operation while disguising it as legitimate infrastructure work. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Detective Park pulled out a financial analysis that looked like something prepared for a major corporation. Conservative estimate based on identified theft locations and duration, $847,000 in stolen utilities. But that doesn't include the community infrastructure projects she was proposing, which would have given her access to electrical systems throughout entire developments. Agent Kim added another layer to the investigation. We've also discovered that she was working with a network of contractors who installed the illegal connections in exchange for legitimate electrical work contracts in the communities she targeted. The criminal enterprise was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Karen hadn't been working alone. She'd built a network of accomplices who provided the technical expertise to execute professional-grade utility theft while maintaining plausible deniability about the criminal nature of their work. Are the contractors being charged as well? We're in the process of identifying and interviewing all parties involved in the installation work. Some appear to have been unknowing participants who believed they were working on legitimate community infrastructure. Others clearly understood the criminal nature of the operations. My phone rang with a call from Hailey, who was still in New York but had been following the news coverage of the expanding investigation. Maya, I'm seeing reports that this is some kind of multi-state fraud operation. How big is this thing? Big enough that the FBI is handling it now. They're saying Karen stole close to $1 million in utilities across 7 communities over 8 years. Jesus. And she tried to expand it to our community. That was apparently the plan. She was positioning herself to propose infrastructure improvements that would have given her access to electrical systems throughout Silver Creek estates. Hailey was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of what we'd uncovered. Maya, I want to make a statement. People need to understand that this isn't just about someone stealing electricity. This is about systematic fraud targeting communities and residents who trusted someone in a position of authority. After the call, Agent Kim showed me evidence that made the scope of Karen's operation even more disturbing. She'd been targeting specific types of communities, upscale developments with elderly residents, celebrity properties with part-time occupants, and gated communities with HOA structures that gave her maximum authority with minimal oversight. The victim selection was strategic, Agent Kim explained. She looked for communities where residents would be less likely to notice utility irregularities and more likely to defer to authority figures who claim technical expertise. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the electrical theft. Karen had been using people's trust in community leadership and their lack of technical knowledge about electrical systems to execute fraud operations that went undetected for months or years. How did she keep getting HOA positions after being investigated for similar crimes? Background checks for HOA leadership positions are often minimal or non-existent. She'd move to a new state, establish residency in a target community, and volunteer for positions that gave her access to the infrastructure and authority she needed. Detective Park showed me copies of HOA meeting minutes from Karen's previous communities, where she'd consistently pushed for expanded authority over utility management and infrastructure oversight. The pattern was identical everywhere: gain position, establish credibility through theft-funded success, propose expansions that would facilitate larger operations. What's her legal exposure looking like? Agent Kim pulled out a sentencing guidelines chart that made federal prison seem inevitable. Multiple counts of wire fraud across state lines, utility theft, conspiracy, money laundering, and criminal enterprise. We're looking at potential sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. The bail hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, and based on the expanding scope of the investigation, it seemed unlikely that Karen would be granted release pending trial. Flight risk doesn't begin to describe someone who'd been running similar operations across 4 states while systematically targeting communities for major fraud. Agent Kim, what happens to the communities she targeted? Restitution will be part of any plea agreement or sentence, but recovery is often limited in financial fraud cases. The technical infrastructure will need to be inspected and potentially rebuilt in each affected location. That afternoon, news broke that would turn Karen's criminal case into a national conversation about HOA governance and community oversight. A coalition of residents from her previous communities had filed a class action lawsuit seeking damages not just for stolen utilities, but for the systematic abuse of authority and breach of fiduciary duty that had enabled her fraud operations. The lawsuit revealed details that made Karen's operation seem even more calculating and cruel. She'd specifically targeted elderly residents and disabled community members for harassment and intimidation, using her authority to silence potential whistleblowers while expanding her criminal activities. Mrs. Chen called me that evening with news that Silver Creek Estates was implementing emergency governance reforms in response to the investigation. We're requiring background checks for all board positions, mandatory financial audits, and community oversight of any infrastructure projects. How are the residents handling all this? Honestly, there's a lot of anger about being deceived and manipulated, but there's also relief that someone finally exposed what was happening. Karen made everyone feel like they were walking on eggshells around HOA violations while she was literally stealing electricity and planning to expand her operations throughout the community. The media attention had reached the level where legal experts were using Karen's case to discuss broader issues of HOA accountability and oversight. Her mugshot was being featured alongside analysis of how community associations could become vehicles for systematic fraud when leadership positions lacked proper vetting and oversight. As I prepared for bed Thursday night, I realized that what had started as mysterious circuit breaker problems at a Texas ranch had uncovered one of the most sophisticated community fraud schemes in recent memory. Karen Whitmore's arrest for stealing electricity had opened investigations in multiple states and triggered nationwide conversations about protecting communities from predatory leadership. The bail hearing tomorrow would determine whether Karen would await trial in jail or under supervised release. But regardless of the outcome, her days of using HOA authority to facilitate criminal operations were over. Sometimes small crimes reveal big patterns. Sometimes local investigations become federal cases. And sometimes the person you catch stealing your electricity turns out to be running a $500,000 fraud operation across multiple states. Karen Whitmore had built her criminal enterprise on the assumption that people wouldn't question authority figures who claimed technical expertise. Tomorrow, she'd find out what happens when that assumption meets federal prosecutors who understand exactly how sophisticated her operation really was. Friday morning brought the kind of media chaos that transforms small courthouse proceedings into national events. By 8 a.m., the Travis County Courthouse was surrounded by news vans, protesters holding signs about HOA accountability, and what appeared to be half of Austin's legal community who'd come to witness what legal experts were calling a landmark case in community fraud prosecution. I arrived with Hailey, who'd flown back from New York specifically to attend Karen's bail hearing and make a statement about holding community leaders accountable for criminal behavior. The sight of cameras and reporters made the courthouse steps look like a red carpet event, except everyone was there to watch someone's life get destroyed by federal prosecutors. Maya, Hailey said as we navigated through the crowd of media, I've been thinking about this all night. This isn't just about someone stealing our electricity. This is about someone who used community leadership as a weapon against vulnerable people while running criminal operations. She was right. The evidence that had emerged over the past 48 hours painted a picture of systematic predation disguised as community service. Karen hadn't just stolen utilities. She'd built an empire of fraud and intimidation that had terrorized residents across multiple states while enriching herself through carefully planned criminal enterprises. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense with the kind of energy that comes from knowing you're about to witness something historic. Federal prosecutors had assembled a team that included specialists in financial crimes, wire fraud, and criminal enterprise prosecution. Karen's defense team looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Karen herself appeared diminished in ways that went beyond the orange jumpsuit and restraints. The confident authority that had defined her interactions with residents and law enforcement had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd watched their entire world collapse in federal court documents. Judge Patricia Williams called the hearing to order with the kind of stern efficiency that suggested she'd reviewed the case files and wasn't impressed by what she'd found. This is a bail hearing for Karen Marie Whitmore, charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, utility theft, criminal enterprise, and conspiracy across state lines. Federal prosecutor David Chen stood to present the government's position on detention, and his opening statement made it clear that Karen wouldn't be going home anytime soon. Your Honor, the defendant represents an exceptional flight risk and danger to communities where she might seek residence. Evidence shows systematic criminal activity spanning 8 years, 7 communities, and 4 states. He presented evidence of Karen's pattern of relocating whenever investigations began, her use of multiple identities to gain community access, and financial records showing offshore accounts and cryptocurrency holdings that suggested sophisticated money laundering operations. The defendant has demonstrated a pattern of targeting vulnerable communities and exploiting positions of trust for criminal purposes. She has the financial means to flee jurisdiction and the established pattern of relocating to avoid prosecution. Karen's defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Martinez, attempted to argue that his client was a community volunteer who'd been over-enthusiastic about energy efficiency improvements. His argument lasted approximately 3 minutes before Judge Williams interrupted with obvious skepticism. Counselor, are you seriously arguing that installing unauthorized electrical connections to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in utilities across multiple states represents over-enthusiastic volunteering? Martinez tried a different approach, suggesting that Karen's medical conditions and community ties made her a suitable candidate for supervised release. Judge Williams reviewed the medical documents with the expression of someone who'd seen every excuse in the book. Mr. Martinez, your client's anxiety and depression don't explain systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple jurisdictions. As for community ties, the evidence suggests she's built those ties specifically to facilitate criminal activities. The prosecutors presented additional evidence that sealed Karen's fate. Financial records showed she'd been funneling stolen utility savings into investment accounts while simultaneously moving money offshore to avoid detection. The operation was far more sophisticated than simple theft. It was organized criminal enterprise with international financial components. Your Honor, Prosecutor Chen continued, we've identified preliminary evidence of similar operations being planned in Nevada, Colorado, and Florida. The defendant was actively researching additional target communities when she was arrested. The scope of Karen's criminal ambitions was staggering. She hadn't been content with her existing fraud operations. She'd been planning expansion into new markets, using the financial returns from utility theft to fund larger operations in additional states. Judge Williams reviewed the evidence with obvious disgust. Ms. Whitmore, you've been charged with systematic criminal activity that targeted vulnerable communities across multiple states. You've exploited positions of trust, stolen significant amounts of money, and demonstrated a clear pattern of relocating to avoid accountability. Karen's bail was denied with prejudice. She would remain in federal custody until trial, with additional charges likely as the investigation expanded. Her request for supervised release was denied, her passport was surrendered, and her assets were frozen pending restitution hearings. As Karen was led back to detention, her expression showed someone who'd finally realized that federal prosecutors don't negotiate with career criminals who think community leadership provides immunity from consequences. Outside the courthouse, the media circus reached fever pitch as legal experts, community advocates, and affected residents provided commentary on what the case meant for HOA governance and community oversight. Hailey's statement to the press was brief but powerful. No one should have to worry that the people elected to protect their community are actually predators using their authority to commit crimes. Karen Whitmore stole from us, but more importantly, she betrayed the trust of every resident who believed she was working in their best interests. The press conference revealed additional developments that showed the investigation was still expanding. FBI agent Kim announced that investigators were reviewing financial records from all 7 communities where Karen had held leadership positions, with preliminary evidence suggesting the total theft amount could exceed $1 million. We're working with utility companies, community associations, and law enforcement agencies in 4 states to identify the full scope of this criminal enterprise, Agent Kim announced. Anyone who believes they may have been victimized by similar utility theft or HOA fraud should contact federal authorities immediately. The afternoon brought news that would turn Karen's case into a template for federal prosecution of community fraud. The Department of Justice announced they were launching a broader investigation into systematic abuse of HOA authority, using Karen's case as a model for identifying similar operations nationwide. Mrs. Chen called me that evening with updates from Silver Creek Estates, where the community was still processing the scope of what they'd discovered. "Maya, we've hired a forensic accounting firm to review every financial transaction Karen authorized during her time as HOA president. The preliminary findings are disturbing." "What kind of disturbing?" "Community improvement projects that never happened, vendor contracts with companies that don't exist, and maintenance expenses that seem to have funded her personal activities. We think the utility theft was just one part of a much larger embezzlement operation." The community that had trusted Karen with their finances and governance was discovering that her criminal activities went far beyond stealing electricity. She'd been systematically looting HOA funds while using her authority to silence anyone who questioned her management. That night, social media exploded with Karen's mugshot alongside analysis of HOA reform and community accountability. Legal experts were calling her case a watershed moment for understanding how community leadership positions could be exploited by sophisticated criminals. The hashtag community accountability was trending nationwide, with residents from across the country sharing their own stories of HOA abuse and calling for reforms that would prevent similar criminal enterprises from operating under the guise of community service. But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from investigative journalists who'd obtained Karen's HOA meeting recordings from multiple communities. The audio revealed a pattern of intimidation, financial manipulation, and systematic targeting of vulnerable residents that painted her as a predator who'd refined her techniques over years of criminal operations. As I prepared for bed Friday night, I reflected on how quickly Karen's world had collapsed once real scrutiny was applied to her activities. 3 days ago, she'd been an HOA president with community authority and criminal operations spanning 4 states. Tonight, she was in federal detention facing decades in prison, while investigators dismantled her criminal empire. The community she'd terrorized was finally free to speak honestly about months of abuse and intimidation. The residents she'd stolen from were getting justice through federal prosecution, and the criminal enterprise she'd built over 8 years was being exposed and dismantled by law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. Sometimes justice comes through complex investigations and federal prosecution. Sometimes it comes through community courage and media attention. And sometimes it comes through the simple recognition that people who abuse authority for criminal purposes deserve consequences regardless of their position or community status. Karen Whitmore had spent years believing that HOA authority made her untouchable. Federal prosecutors were about to prove her very wrong. 8 months later, I sat in the same federal courthouse where Karen's bail had been denied, watching her defense attorney make what could only be described as the most hopeless closing argument in recent legal history. Karen sat at the defendant's table, wearing a federal detention uniform that had replaced her signature tennis whites, her hands folded as her lawyer tried to convince a jury that systematic criminal enterprise was actually misguided community service. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, and it had been a masterclass in how federal prosecutors handle complex financial crimes. They'd presented evidence of Karen's criminal operations spanning 8 years, 7 communities, and 4 states. Witness after witness testified about harassment, intimidation, and theft committed under the authority of various HOA positions. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming. Financial records showed over $1.2 million in stolen utilities and embezzled community funds. Technical experts explained how her sophisticated electrical theft operations worked. Community residents from multiple states testified about systematic abuse and intimidation designed to silence potential whistleblowers. Karen's defense strategy had been predictably desperate. Her attorney argued that she was an enthusiastic community volunteer whose energy efficiency improvements had been misunderstood by ungrateful residents. He claimed that any financial irregularities were bookkeeping errors rather than criminal intent. It didn't work. The prosecution's rebuttal had been devastating. They'd presented recordings of Karen threatening residents who questioned her authority, financial documents showing deliberate money laundering, and technical evidence proving that her utility theft operations required professional criminal expertise and months of planning. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, federal prosecutor David Chen had said in his closing argument, the defendant didn't just break the law once in a moment of poor judgment. She built a criminal empire disguised as community service. She systematically targeted vulnerable communities across 4 states, stealing their money while terrorizing anyone who questioned her authority. The jury deliberated for exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Karen's shoulders sagged as if she'd been physically struck. The reality of federal conviction seemed to hit her all at once: the mandatory minimum sentences, the restitution requirements, the complete destruction of everything she'd worked to build through criminal means. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she had some immediate words for Karen that summarized the case better than any legal brief. "Whitmore, you held positions of trust in multiple communities, and you used that trust to systematically harm the people who elected you to protect them. Your crimes weren't just theft, they were a betrayal of the basic principles that make communities possible." Outside the courthouse, the media response was immediate and comprehensive. Legal experts called the conviction a landmark moment in community fraud prosecution. Community advocates celebrated what they called long overdue accountability for HOA abuse, and residents from Karen's target communities finally felt safe to speak openly about months or years of intimidation and theft. Hailey was there for the verdict, and her statement to reporters captured what the case meant for community governance. This trial proved that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or authority. Karen Whitmore used community leadership as a weapon against the people she was supposed to serve. Today, justice held her accountable. A month later, we returned for sentencing. Karen appeared thinner and older, wearing the kind of defeated expression that comes from watching your entire life collapse in federal court. Her sister was there, looking embarrassed and heartbroken, but I noticed that none of the community residents she'd terrorized showed much sympathy. Judge Williams delivered a sentence that would reverberate through HOA communities across the country: 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with permanent restrictions on any community leadership roles. Additionally, she was ordered to pay $1.4 million in restitution to affected communities and victims. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said, "your systematic targeting of vulnerable communities under color of authority represents one of the most egregious betrayals of public trust this court has seen." The sentence reflects not just punishment, but a message that community leadership is a responsibility, not an opportunity for criminal exploitation. Karen's sister wept quietly in the gallery, but the residents who'd attended the sentencing looked more relieved than sympathetic. These were people who'd been terrorized by her harassment campaigns while she systematically stole from their communities. Seeing justice delivered felt like liberation rather than tragedy. The aftermath rippled far beyond Karen's personal destruction. Her case became required reading in law schools studying community governance and criminal enterprise. HOA management companies nationwide implemented mandatory background checks and financial oversight procedures. The Department of Justice used her conviction as a template for prosecuting similar cases of community fraud. But the most meaningful changes happened in the communities she'd targeted. Silver Creek Estates had been transformed from a fear-based authoritarian structure into a model of transparent governance and community cooperation. The reforms they'd implemented became a blueprint that other communities adopted nationwide. Property values in Karen's former communities actually increased as families sought out neighborhoods with reputations for accountability and inclusive governance. Her criminal operations had damaged everything she'd claimed to protect, while the reforms triggered by her exposure created exactly the kind of communities she'd spent years trying to control. 6 months after sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where Karen was serving her sentence. The envelope was thin, the handwriting uncertain, and the message was brief. "Tell Ms. Bieber that I understand now what community really means. Some lessons cost more than others." I showed the letter to Hailey, who read it with the expression of someone who'd found closure she didn't know she was seeking. "Do you think she actually learned something?" "Hard to say, but I hope so. The woman who wrote that letter sounds different from the one who was stealing our electricity while planning to expand her criminal operations throughout Silver Creek Estates. Are you going to respond?" Hailey thought about it for a long moment. "No. Some conversations end when they end. Karen Whitmore made her choices, and she's living with the consequences. That's how accountability works." A year after the trial, the Karen Whitmore case had fundamentally changed how communities approached governance and oversight. Her mugshot still appeared in news stories about HOA reform and community accountability, usually accompanied by images of the sophisticated electrical theft equipment that had been her downfall. The annual Community Accountability Conference, established in response to her case, brought together legal experts, community leaders, and residents to discuss preventing similar criminal enterprises. The conference featured panels on financial oversight, background screening, and creating cultures of transparency that made community fraud difficult to execute and easy to detect. Silver Creek Estates had become a destination for community governance researchers, who studied how a neighborhood could transform from authoritarian control to collaborative leadership in the aftermath of criminal betrayal. The community that had lived in fear of Karen's clipboard violations had become a model for inclusive, transparent governance. The ranch where Karen had stolen electricity now hosted the annual Texas Community Leadership Summit, where elected HOA officials learned about fiduciary duty, legal compliance, and ethical governance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the site of her criminal operations had become a center for teaching community leaders how to serve their residents honorably. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the cultural shift in how communities thought about leadership accountability. Karen's case had proven that community positions carried real legal responsibilities, that residents had rights that couldn't be violated by authoritarian management, and that criminal behavior disguised as governance would face federal prosecution. From my office at the ranch, I could see the property line where Karen's illegal electrical connections had once stolen power from our systems. The area had been restored and beautified, with native plants and a small memorial garden dedicated to community healing and accountability. Sometimes justice is an 18-year federal sentence and $1.4 million in restitution. Sometimes it's communities learning to govern themselves with transparency and respect. Sometimes it's the recognition that leadership is about service, not control. Karen Whitmore had tried to build a criminal empire by exploiting community trust and targeting vulnerable residents. Her downfall had created a nationwide movement for accountability, transparency, and ethical governance that protected exactly the people she'd spent years victimizing. The utility theft had lasted 4 months. The criminal enterprise had spanned 8 years. The reforms triggered by her prosecution would protect communities for generations. Karen's story ended in a federal prison cell, her authority stripped away, and her criminal operations dismantled. The story of the communities she'd victimized began with healing, reform, and the recognition that real leadership serves others instead of exploiting them. The electricity flowed freely now, powered by legitimate sources, and managed by people who understood that community trust is earned through service, not stolen through criminal enterprise. And every month when the electric bill arrived, paid in full and generated through honest consumption, it served as a reminder that some things in life are worth paying for honestly. Justice had been served, communities had been healed, and Karen Whitmore's criminal legacy had become a cautionary tale that would protect future residents from similar predators who mistook community leadership for criminal opportunity. The end of her story was a prison sentence. The beginning of community healing was everything that came after.